two neighbors with nuclear weapons on the brink of war. India carrying out its deepest strikes inside Pakistan in more than 50 years.
China's role is very interesting here. On one hand is their iron brotherhood with Pakistan. On the other is the reset with India amid the trade war with the US. What does China value more?
We are committed to take firm and decisive action against terrorists and those who support them.
India has just struck Pakistan with overwhelming force. In just hours, waves of missiles surged across the skies and obliterated at least 9 Terralink bases in both Pakistan and areas it holds in Kashmir. But what's even more shocking? This isn't Pakistan's worst fear, it's China's. Xi Jinping has been dreading a moment like this ever since Pakistan backed a horrifying attack on Indian soil. On April 22, 2025, 5 militants armed with M4S and AK-47s quietly slipped into India and stormed Pahalgam, a well-known tourist destination in Kashmir. Echoing the brutality seen in Israel, the gunmen hunted Hindu civilians with ruthless intent. Tourists were stopped, interrogated, and forced to recite Quranic verses to prove they were Muslim. If they succeeded, they were spared. If they failed, they were ordered to undress, since circumcision is common among Muslims but rare among Hindus. Those who failed both tests, mostly Hindu men, were executed in front of their families. The trauma left behind is lifelong. India has responded with vengeance, and China is now entangled, whether it wants to be or not. If Beijing remains silent, its vast investments in Pakistan will not just burn, they'll collapse entirely. Making things worse, Pakistan's army depends heavily on Chinese weapons, gear that's never truly been battle-tested. Now, it's being put to the test. Early signs suggest failure. Chinese radars and missile defenses have completely failed to shield Pakistani airspace, letting Indian strikes hit all planned targets, including one near Lahore. Even worse, a Chinese-made JF-17 fighter jet has been shot down, humiliating both Pakistan and China. If this escalates into full war, the world won't ask who started it. All eyes will turn to those with influence, and China will be right at the center. YouTube tends to dislike war content, and CCP bots suppress criticism, so please support us. Liking and subscribing truly helps. Now, let's get back to the topic. Everyone knows China and Pakistan love to brand themselves as all-weather iron brothers. This tight alliance traces back to 1951, when Pakistan became one of the earliest Muslim nations to recognize the newly formed People's Republic of China. Since then, Beijing has pumped massive funding into Islamabad, so much that today, nearly a third of Pakistan's external debt, around $30 billion, is owed to Chinese state-backed institutions and private lenders. That makes China, by far, Pakistan's largest creditor. But the truth is, China isn't genuinely interested in Pakistan's future or stability. For the Chinese Communist Party, Pakistan is little more than a geopolitical asset and financial outlet. At the center of this is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, a $62 billion mega initiative deeply embedded in China's Belt and Road Plan. Involves an extensive web of roads, railways, fiber-optic lines, energy grids, and industrial complexes connecting China's Xinjiang region to Pakistan's Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea. China has secured a 40-year lease over Gwadar, letting it claim up to 90% of all port-generated revenue. Pakistan, meanwhile, is left scrambling for scraps. The twist: the contracts were crafted so carefully that Pakistan has little hope of ever repaying its enormous debts. From day one, the deals favored Chinese interests, granting their companies major ownership, ironclad leases, and guaranteed payouts. Worse still, Pakistan agreed to buy electricity from Chinese-built plants at high fixed costs, locked in, no matter their economic health. Some contracts even ensure Chinese investors' profits as high as 34.12% annually. With terms this skewed, Pakistan is sliding toward a debt trap that could force it to surrender critical assets, like power stations, highways, and ports, directly to China. And this trap isn't new. Dozens of nations have fallen into similar arrangements. Yet China's interest goes well beyond simple profits. The strategic value of CPC lies in what it offers China, a crucial alternative trade route. Currently, nearly 80% of China's imported oil flows through the narrow Strait of Malacca, a choke point vulnerable to U.S. or Indian naval blockades during crises. CPC lets China bypass that entirely. That's why, if China ever backs Pakistan militarily, India would immediately target CPC. India already deems the corridor illegal, claiming it crosses sovereign land, especially in Gilgit-Baltistan, which India sees as part of Jammu and Kashmir. The Gwadar port at the southern end is even more alarming to India, which suspects it will become a permanent Chinese naval outpost. To grasp how exposed China really is, just examine the map. CPEC begins in Xinjiang, then slips through the high-altitude Khunjerab Pass, entering Pakistan. From there, it runs into Gilgit-Baltistan, a region India strongly disputes. So China's flagship project cuts through contested territory, which New Delhi views as an outright provocation. With conflict already brewing, all that Chinese investment could soon be lost. India could seize areas it claims as its own, turning Kek's northern stretch into a battlefield. China knows this and has quietly deployed thousands of troops to protect its assets. But if war erupts, those efforts may be pointless. Highways, energy hubs, and factories built by China would instantly become sitting targets, well within the range of Indian missiles, jets, and artillery. And these aren't imaginary long-distance attacks. We're talking about rapid, high-precision strikes. As for Pakistan, even with China's money and weapons, it's already struggling to protect these key installations. The economy is unraveling, and the military is stretched too thin, while India continues to hit deep into Pakistani territory. Beijing is now staring down a critical choice: intervene directly with its military to protect billions in investments, or stand back and risk watching everything collapse. But here's the truth: it's highly unlikely China will do that, and I'll explain why in a moment. First, let's shift our focus further south on the map. While the northern areas are in chaos, the crisis brewing in Balochistan is even more troubling for China. If you haven't heard much about Balochistan, don't worry, you're not alone. Most people haven't. But let me break down why this region suddenly matters a lot. Much like the unrest in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir we touched on earlier, Balochistan's issues trace all the way back to 1947, when the subcontinent was split into India and Pakistan. At that time, Balochistan hadn't even decided if it wanted to join Pakistan. You see, a large chunk of present-day Balochistan was once an independent princely state called Kalat. The ruler, known as the Khan of Kalat, initially rejected joining Pakistan altogether. He sought complete autonomy for his territory. However, Pakistan's leadership had different ambitions. Under political and military pressure from Islamabad, the Khan ultimately agreed to merge with Pakistan in 1948. But not everyone accepted that choice. In fact, the Khan's own brother, Prince Abdul Karim, revolted right away. He fled into Afghanistan, gathered armed supporters, and launched the first armed rebellion against Pakistan in July 1948. That uprising laid the foundation for decades of resistance that continues to this day. Now you're probably wondering, why are Baloch insurgents still fighting after nearly 80 years? Well, there are a few key reasons. First of all, Balochistan is massive. It's Pakistan's biggest province by land, covering over 40% of the entire country's territory. It's also incredibly rich in natural resources. We're talking vast natural gas fields, extensive copper mines, gold veins, and oil reserves. Despite all this wealth beneath their feet, Baloch residents remain some of the poorest people in Pakistan. To understand the disparity, consider this. Even though Balochistan supplies over 40% of Pakistan's natural gas, many homes in the province don't even have working gas connections. The wealth generated from Balochistan's land mostly flows to Islamabad and richer regions like Punjab. What do the locals get? Mainly pollution, poverty, and broken promises. Basic infrastructure like schools, clinics, and clean water is severely lacking in large parts of the province. Politically, Baloch leaders are routinely pushed aside, marginalized, or silenced by Pakistan's elite and its powerful military. So imagine how locals felt when China showed up around 2007 with plans to pour billions into roads, rails, and pipelines cutting straight through their ancestral lands. At first, China made sweeping promises, talking about creating jobs, improving lives, building schools, and unlocking economic potential. But those pledges quickly fell flat. Instead, locals were met with a flood of Chinese personnel, increased military presence, and new highways bulldozing across tribal areas they had lived in for generations. Foreign flags appeared, armed checkpoints sprouted, and suddenly, many residents no longer recognized their own towns. Naturally, resentment exploded. Armed resistance surged. Groups like the Balochistan Liberation Army, BLA, began targeting Chinese workers and projects directly. For example, in April 2022, a suicide bomber killed 3 Chinese instructors at a university in Karachi. The year before, in 2021, a bomb struck a bus full of Chinese engineers, killing 9. These are just the big stories. In reality, there have been countless smaller attacks on Chinese nationals and infrastructure throughout Balochistan. But that's only half the story. Another major challenge China and Pakistan now face is the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan in 2021. Many expected the Taliban to stay friendly with Pakistan, given Islamabad's years of support and shelter. Surprisingly, things took a very different turn. Since returning, the Taliban has shown growing hostility toward Pakistan. Tensions have risen sharply. In December 2022, Taliban fighters attacked Pakistani border posts near Chaman, killing multiple soldiers. Again, in September 2023, heavy clashes erupted at the Torkham border crossing, resulting in deaths and injuries on both sides. The Taliban hasn't kept its displeasure a secret. Its leaders accuse Pakistan of meddling in Afghanistan's affairs, harboring opposition forces, and acting more like a rival than a friend. As a result, Baloch militants have found it far easier to move and operate along the porous Afghanistan-Pakistan border. For years, Afghanistan has discreetly offered refuge, housing, and even training spaces for groups hostile to Pakistan. Now, with the Taliban back in power and more openly distrusting Pakistan, this pattern has sharply accelerated. It's now easier than ever for anti-Pakistan militants to travel, organize, and stage operations from Afghan soil. Meanwhile, perhaps unexpectedly, the Taliban's ties with India have shown signs of improvement. Initially, India was understandably wary. After all, the Taliban were once viewed as adversaries, especially since India had been a strong backer of the previous Afghan administration. However, in recent months, India and the Taliban have initiated discreet diplomatic outreach, aiming to explore shared interests. In fact, India has delivered humanitarian supplies to Afghanistan and even resumed operations at its embassy in Kabul. Essentially, India seems to be applying the classic strategy: an enemy's enemy might be a friend. And so far, that approach seems to be producing some tangible results. There are even whispers, though still unverified officially, that certain Taliban elements may be secretly helping India locate and possibly target Pakistani insurgents or fugitives sheltering along the Afghanistan-Pakistan frontier. While surprising at first glance, this idea isn't too far-fetched. Historically, the Taliban have worked with various militant outfits, so forming covert alliances behind closed doors isn't unprecedented. Especially now, given the mounting hostility between the Taliban and Pakistan, such back-channel cooperation doesn't sound entirely improbable. In contrast, the Taliban's relationship with China is proving far more fragile. Publicly, the Taliban have expressed willingness to welcome Chinese investments, particularly because China offers the promise of crucial funds and infrastructure. But underneath, there's a deep undercurrent of mistrust. Many in the Taliban view China's treatment of its Uyghur Muslim population in Xinjiang with suspicion and resentment. This discontent is amplified by ethnic, religious, and cultural ties between Afghans and Uyghurs. Amid all this, the situation involving the Taliban, Baloch insurgents, and India's evolving stance has created a volatile atmosphere for both Pakistan and China, especially threatening their joint ventures like CPC and the wider BRI. To clarify briefly, people often mix up CPC with the Belt and Road Initiative. While related, they're not quite the same. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a major piece, but just one piece, of the far larger Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is China's grand-scale global infrastructure strategy. It's a bold plan to build highways, rail networks, ports, and power grids across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Through this strategy, China hopes to lower shipping costs, unlock new markets, and place itself firmly at the center of future global trade and politics. While CPC is significant, the Belt and Road is vastly broader. It's the giant blueprint behind a new economic world order. So far, China has poured roughly $1 trillion into the BRI, and estimates suggest this figure might soar past $4 trillion by the 2030s. That's trillion with AT. We're talking about investments big enough to reshape international trade and geopolitical alliances for decades. When China first revealed these grand ambitions, dozens of countries eagerly signed on, lured by dreams of growth and wealth. And in fairness, China pitched the whole thing as a golden opportunity. But reality has turned out quite different. Many of these countries now face severe financial strain, struggling to repay the enormous loans tied to their Chinese-backed projects. Some, in fact, are verging on bankruptcy. Sri Lanka is the most notable cautionary tale. The country borrowed huge sums from China for infrastructure, including the massive Hambantota port. When Sri Lanka inevitably defaulted, China stepped in and assumed control of the port under a 99-year lease, gaining strategic leverage over a key asset alarmingly close to India. And Sri Lanka's case isn't unique. In Africa, countries like Zambia, Kenya, and Ethiopia are now drowning in debt after accepting Chinese-funded ventures. Worse still, many have seen minimal economic improvement from the deals. Zambia, in fact, made headlines after defaulting on its foreign debt, partly due to overborrowing from China and falling behind on payments. And China seemed to assume Pakistan would follow the same path. Like the others, Pakistan has found that Chinese investments haven't helped revive its economy. Quite the opposite. It's now buried under crushing debt. Pakistan's foreign currency reserves are nearing critical lows, inflation is soaring, and the cost of living has surged beyond control. The country is barely managing to cover interest payments on its loans, forget repaying the principal. What China was truly banking on was a scenario similar to Sri Lanka's, where Pakistan would fall so deeply into financial trouble that Beijing could swoop in and gain lasting influence, especially over strategic zones like Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, POK. But this entire playbook could collapse if conflict erupts and India acts preemptively, bombing key sites and reclaiming land it considers historically its own. That would instantly derail China's plans, erasing years of investment and strategy. Losing access to CPC, the centerpiece of the Belt and Road Initiative, would trigger a cascade effect. Other nations participating in the BRI would pause and reconsider. Hold on, if China can't secure its flagship project sitting right near home, why should we take any risks on our own soil? That moment could mark the collapse of Xi Jinping's grand geopolitical ambition. The uncertainty surrounding CPC is like a live wire for the entire BRI, and Beijing knows it can't afford to let it fail. Still not convinced China would defend Pakistan? Consider this. Thousands of Chinese workers, engineers, and military personnel are already stationed inside Pakistan. By some accounts, more than 14,000 Chinese nationals are currently involved in CPC-related operations. Many of them are working in highly unstable regions such as Gwadar and parts of Balochistan, areas that have seen repeated attacks on Chinese interests. Just within recent years, there have been over a dozen major assaults directly targeting Chinese citizens, with dozens killed. Chinese officials have not kept silent. They've condemned these incidents harshly, even going public to say it's unacceptable that they've faced 2 deadly attacks within just 6 months. That's why Beijing dispatched its own armed security units, complete with armored vehicles, to guard critical infrastructure. Now picture how this situation could spiral if India escalates further. So far, Indian strikes have been limited to places like Muzaffarabad, Kotli, and parts of Punjab. But Gwadar and the wider Balochistan region aren't far off. Should tensions climb or China choose to get involved militarily, every Chinese individual, engineer, technician, soldier, and their families, from Karachi to Lahore and beyond, would become a prime target. China would be forced to conduct emergency evacuations while also trying to secure billions of dollars in assets. In such a dire state, the Pakistani military might even hand over the defense of key installations to Chinese forces. Realistically, China understands it would have no choice but to intervene once its citizens and investments are in harm's way. This is one reason China has over the years coaxed, bribed, or pressured Pakistan's leadership into total dependency on Chinese weapons. Pakistan is now the world's largest importer of Chinese arms, buying everything from JF-17 fighter aircraft and VT-4 tanks to advanced drones and missile systems. This makes joint operations seamless if China steps in. Their gear is already integrated. In contrast, India's military arsenal is a hybrid of Russian, French, Israeli, American, and indigenous systems. Analysts argue that any India-Pakistan conflict would effectively become a live demo, a direct battle between Chinese-manufactured arms and India's blended, Western-backed force. And the outcome would have enormous consequences. If Chinese systems underperform, China's reputation as a leading arms exporter could nosedive. On the other hand, if India's mix of foreign and domestic tech excels, it would strengthen global trust in Western gear and boost arms sales for allied nations. We've already seen similar reputational fallout. Consider Russia. Its military tech was once highly regarded, but after consistent failures in Ukraine, ineffective air defense, poor tank performance, and weak logistics, global confidence in Russian arms has crumbled. Many buyers are now walking away. Russia's dominance in the global arms market has likely ended for at least a generation. A similar fate could await China. Just hours into conflict, some of its military tech is already failing. Sophisticated radar systems aren't picking up incoming threats. Missile shields are missing targets, and even a JF-17, once touted as a capable combat aircraft, has been downed. If this continues, it'll be clear Chinese weapons can't endure even brief assaults, let alone a prolonged war. But reputation and arms sales aren't China's only concern. There's an even greater issue at play: strategic positioning. For decades, Pakistan has acted as China's frontline partner and a buffer against India's rising power in South Asia. This alliance has become deeply rooted over time, and Beijing knows its influence in the region is tied directly to Islamabad. Back in 1963, several decades ago, Pakistan officially ceded the rugged Shaksgam Valley, just north of Kashmir, over to China. This move helped Beijing strengthen its grip on parts of the larger Kashmir area. Today, China maintains firm control over about 20 to 30% of the broader Kashmir region, including the high-altitude Aksai Chin Plateau, which India also claims. But this zone isn't just a symbolic or contested piece of land, it holds major strategic value. Aksai Chin hosts China's G219 highway, the only dependable land route linking Xinjiang with Tibet. Defense experts continue to stress that if China ever loses control of Aksai Chin, or even if the road is blocked due to conflict, it could put China's entire western frontier at serious risk. Should war break out between India and Pakistan, there's a legitimate threat that Indian troops could advance deeper into disputed zones, bringing them alarmingly close to the sensitive line of actual control, LAC, with China near Ladakh. Indian commanders have stated clearly they're training to engage on two active fronts simultaneously. In simple terms, they're prepared to face China head-on if the situation requires. We've already seen how explosive this border can get. In 2020, troops from India and China clashed in the Galwan Valley. That brutal confrontation shocked both sides and proved how fast tensions could erupt. In the event of a large-scale war with Pakistan, India could intentionally stir things up in Ladakh, hoping to stretch China's military across two fronts and apply extra pressure to Tibet, a region that's already highly sensitive for Beijing on cultural, political, and military levels. Even a minor standoff in Ladakh could force China to shift attention, resources, and troops, opening the door to domestic unrest or a broader fight. India's not taking this lightly. They've strengthened their position with new weaponry, like the French-built jets, tailored for high-altitude air combat. On top of that, India possesses the BrahMos, a supersonic cruise missile built in partnership with Russia. This weapon travels at over 3 times the speed of sound and can hit targets deep inside enemy lines with almost no warning. Deploying BrahMos batteries in Ladakh or other mountain zones would instantly tilt the balance. India could hold key Chinese infrastructure, air bases, and supply lines in Tibet at risk, giving them a clear upper hand. Still, even with these clear threats to its interests, China may hesitate before joining the fight. There are compelling reasons why Beijing might stay on the sidelines. To begin with, China's economy, after decades of explosive expansion, has hit serious headwinds. The years 2023 and 2024 were especially rough. A massive property crisis and weak consumer spending choked growth. China's debt levels are now sky high. One IMF estimate from 2024 showed Chinese government debt reaching 60.5% of GDP, up from just 38.5% 5 years ago. When adding corporate, household, and local government debt, the total is now around 312% of GDP, among the highest in the world. Local authorities are buried under unpaid loans for half-built apartment towers and deserted malls. So far, Beijing has responded by pumping billions into the economy in an effort to barely meet their modest 5% growth goals. Meanwhile, China's population is now shrinking. The birth rate fell to an all-time low in 2023, and the country lost an estimated 1.4 million people. Over the next few years, nearly 300 million Chinese are set to retire, draining the labor market. That means fewer active workers, soaring pension costs, and an unemployment crisis among young people. Now imagine trying to fund a full-scale war in the middle of that storm. China simply isn't in the shape to start another costly, risky conflict. With internal instability rising and economic priorities stacking up, leaders in Beijing may choose restraint, not aggression. China's armed forces are already stretched across several high-risk zones. For example, Beijing has gradually built up its air and naval presence across the South China Sea, frequently coming into confrontation with nations like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines over contested waters, reefs, and islands. Then there's the ever-tense Taiwan Strait, where China repeatedly signals its readiness to use force if necessary to reunify with Taiwan. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to send aircraft carriers through those same waters and strengthen military ties with Taiwan's allies. Beijing fully understands how volatile that theater already is. Opening up a third front along the Himalayan border with India would push China's military into a dangerously overextended position. If such a war were to break out, China would be forced to shift key assets, missiles, fighter aircraft, naval fleets, and soldiers away from areas like Taiwan and the South China Sea, where they are sorely needed. Worse still, a Himalayan conflict could draw larger powers into the fight. If the U.S. military chose to aid India, or if Moscow felt compelled to support China more openly, the entire balance could spiral. That is not a scenario Beijing wants to see unfold. And it wouldn't just be China with concerns. A regional war that includes Chinese involvement would unsettle the whole world. The U.S. has steadily grown closer to India via agreements like the Quad and multiple bilateral security deals. Publicly, Washington would urge calm and restraint, as it always does when India and Pakistan clash. In fact, both China and the United States already called for calm after the most recent attack in Kashmir. But realistically, if Chinese bombers or combat units began moving into Pakistani territory to threaten India, Washington would almost certainly respond behind the scenes. That might mean passing along satellite data, speeding up arms shipments, or even offering behind-the-scenes diplomatic support. Russia, for its part, would find itself in a tight corner. While it has grown close to China, Moscow has long been one of India's main military suppliers and still sells advanced weaponry to New Delhi. Most likely, Russia would try to stay neutral, calling for peace while preserving ties with both sides. Middle Eastern nations may also be pulled into the equation. Historically, Pakistan has leaned on wealthy Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for funds, military help, and political cover. But in a showdown involving both China and India, those Arab states would proceed very cautiously. The reality is that no one comes out ahead in a war involving China, certainly not Beijing itself. Sure, China often benefits when India is a bit distracted by regional tensions. But there's a world of difference between tolerating some chaos and stumbling into a full-scale disaster. A war with India isn't something China truly desires. The risks are too high, the cost too steep, and the fallout too uncertain, especially at a time when China is already grappling with internal instability and slowing growth. Beijing knows the real root of this current spike in tensions. Militant groups operating unchecked inside Pakistan can't be brushed aside forever. If India fails to handle them firmly this time, China may feel forced to act directly to protect its own stakes. At this point, Beijing can no longer afford to sit by while chaos threatens its billions of dollars of investments. Thank you for watching and subscribe to watch more videos like this.